Good evening all and welcome. Tonight I have a creepy collection of ghost stories for your listening pleasure. So buckle up because it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. My father-in-law hunts on my family's lake house. He had been going to summer camp on Lake Winnipesaukee since he was a little kid. Every summer, same camp. Him and his brothers his whole life. In the 80s, the camp closed down and then sold off as lots on the island where the camp was to former campers. My father-in-law bought one of the properties and started bringing his own children there every summer. Fast forward 30 years, I marry his eldest daughter and start going up to the lake every weekend with my wife and her family. Unfortunately, after a few years of this, my father-in-law succumbed to leukemia and was no longer with us. Or so everyone thought. Every summer since he had passed, I have had at least one unexplainable incident happen to me up at the lake house. It usually happens the weekends we open up our lake house for the summer or the weekend that we close down for the winter. There is often an incident when we have a lot of family come for visits too. The first time I noticed something was amiss was the first summer we opened camp after he'd passed away. As I am the eldest male in the family now, it's typically my job to do all the heavy lifting. I was unloading our boatload of supplies on the dock with a little wagon that I used to haul all of my wife's stuff from the boat to the house. I carefully stacked all of our stuff in a pyramid-like shape so that when I pulled the wagon, nothing would wiggle loose and fall off. After 3 trips from the boat to the wagon, I had just one bag left in the boat to grab. As I turned back towards the wagon with the final bag, I froze in my tracks. A brand new rug still rolled up and in plastic wrap that I had buried in our bags on the wagon, so it wouldn't roll off, was now out from under all the stuff I'd piled on top of it and was leaning at a 45-degree angle on the side of the cart, just sitting up in the air. Not anything close to how I'd left it, right there and in front of me. My blood ran cold. As I pulled the wagon towards our house, I called out to my wife, "Your dad says hello." The following day, when I was alone in my brother-in-law's little shack, I was busy setting up furniture and making beds, getting our camp ready for visitors. Suddenly, an acorn struck me in the back of the head and then tumbled to the ground. I looked up, wondering if a rodent or something scurried by and knocked it onto me, but there was nothing but the open pitch of the roof above my head. He said hello again, and I ran out of there. The next summer, we had a little family reunion of sorts, and my wife's cousins and all their kids came to spend the weekend with us at the lake. One afternoon, I was out back behind the house grilling some lunch for everyone. Everyone else was down at the beach or playing in the water. As I walked through the back door, a balled-up Pikachu bathrobe came flying down the stairs and hit me in the face. In a fury, I pulled the robe off my face and stormed up the stairs, intent on giving whoever did this a good talking to. But there was no one. There was no one else in the house but me. Nobody believed me when I told them what happened. The following summer, when my wife started to believe it, for some reason my wife had been digging around under our cabin, where her mum and dad used to stay before we built the main house, and she found an old set of wrenches that had sunken down in the dirt under the house, probably after many rainstorms. She was washing the old tools off in the sink, and when I came into the kitchen and scoffed, explaining that you don't use water to wash metal tools, you should use WD-40 or something, she told me I didn't know what I was talking about, and to that I respond, "If your father were here, he'd tell you the same thing." To which my wife said, "No, he wouldn't," very confidently. Suddenly a bar stool that was positioned between my wife and I jumped and moved an inch. It didn't slide across the floor or anything, but it certainly hopped slightly. It was noticeable and made a pretty loud thud. My wife and I were both startled, and I said, "See? I told you your dad agrees." From that day on, she stopped questioning me about my encounters with her father. I used to work at a thrift store for about 3 years, and by that point, I was used to creepy and paranormal things happening, since the majority of the items we'd get in belonged to the recently deceased. Let me give you a small layout of what the store looked like. Our store was pretty large, and there were technically 3 sections to it. The first was the entrance of the store, which consisted of clothing, linens, knickknacks, kitchenware, and shoes, and we also had a hallway that led to the second half of the store. This section had wall decor, a library room, bathroom item sections, and an electronics room. Lastly, the third section of the entire building was what we called the warehouse. At the entrance of the warehouse were our lockers and the manager's office to the right, then the electronics testing area and the sorting and pricing table to the left. The rest of the warehouse was very large and had tons of giant cardboard boxes called gaylords. These cardboard boxes are about 4 to 5 feet tall and have various sorted items inside of them. They were all aligned to the right side of the warehouse in 4 rows. We kept those to the side because they usually had holiday items we'd use for later for big events. We'd also make pathways large enough to get to them and into them if need be. Located at the very, very far back of the corner were the boxes full of clothing, which we called the clothing area. There we would sort through the clothes and hang them on racks. Then we dragged them to the first section of the store and put the clothes on the sales floor. Now, for the story. I was closing with my other co-worker, and it was just the two of us. That night I remember it was winter, so even though it was only around 6 p.m, outside it already looked like midnight. My co-worker had asked me to put away all the clothes on the rack and then place the rack by the clothing area in the warehouse when I was done. We only had one customer in the store at the time, and the lady was browsing through things in the electronics section, and my co-worker was up front taking care of the register for me while I went to put away the empty rack. I walked down the hallway and entered the back of the store to the warehouse. I only turned on one of the lights, which brightened the clothing area, and left the rest of the warehouse dimly lit. I didn't notice anything at first, and carried on dragging this tall metal and noisy rack back to the corner of the warehouse. When I finally reached the clothes area and turned around, I heard a low wheezing sound, almost like a witchy growl, or someone silently trying to clear their airway. I stood there frozen and creeped out by the noise, and thought maybe it was my co-worker trying to scare me. I even remember speaking towards the area the sound had come from, calling out my co-worker's name. "Hello? Shannon?" No answer. I ignored it after a few seconds of standing there and began to walk steadily back towards the entrance of the warehouse. That's when I saw a short black shadow in my peripheral vision towards the row of boxes that were 2 or 3 feet away. I didn't stop walking, but I did turn my head towards the shadow and my heart dropped to my stomach. I saw a black 5-foot hunched over spirit following alongside me. It creepily limped and kept up with my speed, going past every box. It looked like an injured old lady with a broken foot and horrid posture. I remember at this point I slightly began to run and kept my eyes on the spirit, hoping she wouldn't come towards us. She just kept limping and yet running alongside me until she went through the glass window and into my manager's office, vanishing completely. Panicked and afraid, I ran to my co-worker, and just one look at me she knew I had seen something horrifying. I told her everything, and she immediately believed me without hesitation. We both politely kicked the customer out early and closed the registers early too. My co-worker had been working at the thrift store for a few years and knew that items we get sometimes come with a little extra. She too has experienced many strange and frightening things while working there, but she had never heard of someone seeing a full-body apparition like the one I saw. A few days later, Shannon tells my boss and a few other co-workers about my experience, and another co-worker, Rita, said she was closing the following night after my experience and saw the same hunched-over spirit in the warehouse. Hearing this gave me goosebumps. My story starts when I was 11 years old, and an only child, living with both my mum and dad. We lived in a 2-story farmhouse that was built around 1900, and my father still resides there to this day. He was a police officer for a small city located about 12 miles from our home, and worked the midnight shift as a shift sergeant. So at night it was just me and my mum there. The house is out in the country, and surrounded by nothing but fields and pastures, so as a child I spent a lot of time in the fields and woods playing in the barns we had. My mother was a stay-at-home mother. The house was heated by a Franklin wood stove, the kind that has the doors that open in front and fold up as you open it. It was located in what we called the middle of the room. The downstairs consisted of a large kitchen, a large middle room, and then a big living room. Directly above the wood stove in the ceiling is a metal grate that's about 1.5 feet by 1.5 feet. This is to allow the heat rising off the stove to go upstairs. My parents' room was directly above the middle room, and their bed was right next to the metal grate in their floor. My room was right off theirs. The stairway was located in my room, and the wall that the stairs came up to was completely open, exposing the stairway with a banister to keep me from falling over down the stairs. The incident took place one night in early fall. Dad was at work, so it was just me and my mum at home. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was awoken to the sound of the fireplace poker striking the wood stove, and it sounded as if someone was stirring the fire and not being quiet about it at all. My first thought was, why the heck is she building a fire? It's hot here already. After probably another 30 seconds of banging, I heard my mother call out my name. The only thing was, she was calling my name from her room. When she called out my name, the banging stopped, and I responded back with, "Yes? What are you doing, son?" "I'm not doing anything, I'm in bed." "Then who's doing that?" she asked. I told her I didn't know. I thought it was her. So I got up a little scared. My thought was that someone had broken into the house. My mum grabbed the .38 S&W she kept in her nightstand and we go downstairs. When we get to the room, the doors are wide open on the stove and the poker is laying in the stove. We searched the entire house and checked all the doors and windows, but nothing. Mum checked to make sure there was no bird in the chimney. Nope, all good there. So we close up the stove, place the poker back under the stove, and go back upstairs to our respective beds. No sooner than we get in bed, and it starts again. Only this time it's much louder than before. I get up and go to their room. My mum is laying in bed, looking over the edge at the grate, and looking down at the stove. When I looked too, I was blown away. There, in the light of the kitchen light, you could see the doors were open again and the poker was slamming around all over the place in the stove, but there was no one holding it. My mum yelled out, "Who's there?" and the poker fell to the floor. Again, we go downstairs and check everything. It was all as we left it. The stove doors were open again, the poker laying on the floor in front of the stove, and we still talk about it to this day. I never saw anything else and that never happened again, but after that, I would hear the stairs creak slowly in the night, as if someone was slowly walking up them. And even today, it feels like you're being watched in that house. In later years, I discovered that when my dad bought the house, he got it for a very good price. The former owners, an elderly couple, had lived there their entire married life, and when the last one died, it stood empty for a long time after it was a rental and no one stayed. It was found that their only son, a Vietnam veteran, and after coming home developed many issues, until one day he went down to the cellar and took his own life with a rifle. A very sad ending. Still today, that place gives me the creeps big time. There's a dark energy there, and I always hated the cellar. That was when I was a kid, and I didn't even know what happened. It just felt evil, and like there were eyes on you. It was the beginning of a journey into the unknown for me. Even though it was years before the other things began to happen around me, that night still gives me chills big time just remembering it. My Girl Guides group used to meet in the elementary school library, where there was an ongoing rumor that one of the custodians died under the school, and you could see him opening and closing the doors as he walked through the school. That you could hear his breathing and the keys on his belt jingle as he continued his job in the afterlife. This rumor was around for a long time, even when I attended school. Several times when my guide group was leaving the library, a chair or two would fall off the desk. We used to say it was the ghost getting angry that we were leaving. My mother was one of the guide leaders, so I would almost always leave last. When we were wrapping up a meeting one night, a friend and I were hanging out in the library reading the books while the other girls were getting picked up. My mother called us from down the hall, and we got up to leave, and as soon as we walked out the door, every single chair crashed to the ground and the power bumped. As cliche as it sounds, I think about that ghost a lot, whether or not he was ever real. After my grade graduated to high school, his activity stopped completely and he was slowly forgotten. I don't think his stories are told anymore in the school. A lot of the staff retired and were replaced, and my age group who would remember him all graduated or have graduated already. And honestly, it feels like I've lost a friend. I grew up with a ghost. My brother and both my parents acknowledge we had a ghost in our house. In fact, when my parents sold the house in 1995, they actually disclosed the house was haunted. I became aware of him when I was around 5. We never saw him, it was just a feeling or a presence in the room. Though I never saw his physical form, he manifested in my thoughts as a Confederate soldier, as I live in the south of Georgia. In high school, I went to the library, because this was the late 70s, early 80s, and researched as much as I could about the Civil War battles in the area, and whether or not our house was built on top of a graveyard or anything like that. Thankfully, there's no record to say it was. I called him Harvey after the rabbit in the Jimmy Stewart movie, and he seemed to like the name. To me, he was my guardian angel and protected me when I was scared and would make me feel safe. As an aside, my maternal grandmother was criminally insane and tried to murder me when I was 12. She was such an evil woman. I knew she would come back to finish the job on me, I swear. I could always feel Harvey's presence, and I knew as long as he was around I was safe from her. Though it was creepy as hell to hear him walk around the house, and he'd close doors that were left open. Yes, you would walk into a room, and halfway across the room the door would close for you. My dog would begin barking when Harvey would enter the room, and would stare at the part of the room in which I felt he was standing in. He also had a fetish about scissors. Never really figured that one out. We could never keep a pair of scissors in the house longer than a few weeks, and then they'd vanish. My parents would ask me and my brother, and we'd be like, nope, no idea. When my parents sold the house in 95, they were cleaning out the garage and found over 40 pairs of scissors stashed in the back behind a metal shelving unit. We figured Harvey put them there. Maybe he was very cautious of them. He was also helpful. My mum and I worked together at Bell South in the early 90s, and I was living on my own at the time. She comes into work and is upset because she dropped her glasses and stepped on them that morning and they were broken, so she was having a hard time reading stuff that day. My dad was out of town and my brother lived in Boston, so we get through the workday. I've picked on her somewhat for her glasses, and then we went on with our respective ways home at the end of the day. Later that evening, my mum calls me and tells me I'm quite the sneaky one and that she really appreciates what I did for her. I ask her what I did. She goes on to tell me she really appreciates me getting her glasses fixed for her, as when she got home, they were on the kitchen table, as she'd left them in the upstairs master bathroom, and that they were repaired, the frames no longer broken. I told her point blank to thank Harvey as I didn't do it. My brother was in another state and my dad was out of town on business. And it's not like we're the kind of people that just give anyone keys to our house to get in. We don't trust people that much. So yeah, it was probably Harvey the ghost. When I got married, I felt like he followed me to my house for a bit, but then he left as he realized I had a husband that loves me and looks out and protects me. I have no need for my guardian angel, and haven't done in decades, but I know if I should need him, Harvey will hopefully reappear. I hope whomever he is, his protection is appreciated as always. I grew up in a household that I believe had a haunted house. The house was surprisingly large in Burnett, Texas. At the time that these stories were taking place, I was 6 years old. This house was a place that used to be a rodeo, and from what I have been told, I believe it's factual, because when I grew up in the house, there was a full-scale kiddie train in the backyard with a complete train track, the conductor's booth, and the cars for everyone to sit in. At night, sometimes my mother would hear noises and see the silhouette of a man in a cowboy hat running down the hallway. By the time the man's silhouette would get to the other end of the hallway, it would vanish. Due to the fact that I'd never dealt with this story personally, I did not take any stock in the supernatural until much later in life. This next story took place at a trailer home in Weir, Texas. This home is 2 driveways down from the granary that is part of the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie film set. The truck from the original movie is still parked outside the granary. I was 13 at the time, and we lived on farmland and had roughly 37 goats and 2 guard dogs. There is a long strand of trees running along the length of a creek on the property, and a second row of trees running the same direction as the first, creating a fair-sized clearing at the back of the property. Just before running into a massive wooded area, we started having an issue shortly after we got the goats. That quickly took a turn for the worse. Over the course of 2 months, these goats began disappearing and getting picked off quickly. One day while I was outside walking down the creek, I walked to the clearing by the back of the property. The grass in the clearing was high. It came up to my waist, and I saw the bloated corpse of one of our goats laying on its side and a dog-like creature standing over it with its face down against the goat. It was still fairly far away, so I couldn't exactly see all of the creature, nor its features. But it was large, and had odd patches of grey and black fur. I charged full speed at it, and as I got closer, I looked up, and when it looked at me, its closest resemblance was a hyena. It didn't have a tail, its face seemed odd, and it ended up running away and disappearing somewhere. I couldn't see where it had disappeared to, and ended up leaving without taking a closer look at the goat. Looking back, to better depict this animal, its back was tall and came up to my chest, making it about 5 feet. That was the only time I ever saw this creature. My next story occurred when I was 16, at my current abode. My mum had married my stepdad previously that year, and I kept getting eerie vibes at the house the longer I stayed there. Plus, my older stepsister had told me about the poltergeist that would throw her books across the room and flip through the pages vehemently. One night I was relaxing in the game room and playing World of Warcraft by myself sitting in a comfortable chair, when the radio turned to static at exactly 3 a.m. The fact that the radio turned on wasn't as scary as the fact that the remote for it had gone missing prior to us moving there, and that we had never found it. I, without looking at the radio, stood up and walked directly towards the TV in front of me, and turned it on. I sat there uncomfortably, talking to my online friends until after 4 a.m., then quietly stood up, turned off the TV and radio, and went to bed. A few years later, I went to bed one night, still in the same house, at a decent hour and fell asleep on my back, face to the ceiling. I woke up at 3 a.m. on the dot with an uneasy feeling, and without blinking immediately noticed a massive figure standing over me. For reference, to the left of my bed was a bookshelf that was built into the wall and ran from floor to the ceiling. This shadowy figure, which was darker than the darkness of the countryside, was about 6 inches from touching an 8-foot-tall ceiling with his head. I kept my eyes open for a long period of time because I had the feeling that if I blinked, I wouldn't see him again. I looked at him closely and held my quick drying eyes open for about 15 to 20 seconds, just staring at this shadowy mass on the wall. He was tall, slender, and had what looked like a hood on his head, and the closer I looked, the more I realized that's where the eyes should have been. There was a darkness that was somehow darker than whatever dark substance the rest of him was made from. Everything about his eyes was somehow the darkest part of him. After that span of seconds passed, I blinked and could no longer see him, but had an uneasy feeling about being watched. I turned my back to him and went to sleep. The next year, my girlfriend at the time was sleeping over, just after we watched that movie, Paranormal Activity. And then we went to sleep next to each other. When we woke up, my girlfriend had 3 claw marks down her back for no apparent reason, and she told me she had a dream about a tall, hooded figure walk through the hallway and stop to stare at her from the hallway. I never actually told her about my incident with the shadowy figure. 2 years after this, on my 18th birthday, me and my mum went down to 6th Street in Austin, Texas to get my first tattoo done. After discovering that they wanted to charge me nearly 4 times as much as the guy from my hometown for far worse quality, we left and ended up giving a homeless dude my money because he was honest about going to drink himself silly for the last call. We ended up driving back to Georgetown, Texas, and on the way my mum suggested that we go ghost hunting with the phone application. We drove to a Pedernales Electrical Company right off IH-35 northbound in Ware, Texas. It was around 2:45 a.m. when we parked in their parking lot. We sat there trying to contact the spirit of a girl named Orange Socks, who was a Jane Doe whose name never got uncovered and whose body was found dumped in the riverbed across the street from where we were parked. The application is a combination of a radar and a chat box where the ghost talks to you. I wasn't sure how I felt about the app initially. It just seemed like a quirky thing that wouldn't work. I told my mum there weren't any ghosts out there, and she decided to drive down the dirt road leading from the Pernadales deeper into Ware. As she drove, I got uncomfortable and told her we should turn around and head home because there probably weren't any ghosts out there. As soon as I said that, the entire radar lit up green with hundreds of little orbs, and the text box began to work, translating like crazy. The application said frog, blanket, tennis, and I barely had enough time to roll my eyes at the building fear just before my mum stopped the car dead in a bridge that was barely a car's length long because a giant bullfrog about a foot wide hopped in front of the car. We both looked up and both saw what looked like a giant blanket flapping vigorously in the wind that didn't exist. Then we both witnessed it vanishing into nothing. My mum, being the supernatural white woman that she is, gets out the car with a flashlight, much like Fred from Scooby-Doo, and starts to investigate. I, being absolutely freaked out at this point in the premonition, threatened to leave my mother if she didn't get her ass back in the car and drive. She complied, and we left to get a Whataburger on the way to our house. My nerves start to calm down, and I start feeling more at ease about the whole thing. So we step outside so I can smoke a cigarette, and I look over to the parking lot while we're chatting and notice an oddly luminescent tennis ball perched casually at the corner of the parking lot. I start to get uneasy again and tell my mum we should leave. As we get in the car and drive towards the parking lot exit, there's another tennis ball right at the exit, then placed at the turning lane on our way home. Then placed on the right street until our next turn. These tennis balls led all the way up to the gate of our house, which unless you've been there before is very hard to find, and I usually have to help guests find the place. I'm panicking now because my mum and myself are the only two people at home right now. Everyone else had gone on a 3-hour trip to the coast for the weekend. My mum pulls up to the house and we get out. Me being more cautious than her, I get out slowly and walk behind her. There are 2 electrical boxes for this house, and they're nowhere near each other, and all the lights are usually left on when we're not at home because of how dark it gets. When I say this is the only time the power has cut off in over a decade, I can't make this up. The power in the entire house cut off, and I ran as hard as I could until the lights came back on. Thinking back, there was probably a spot directly under the giant oak tree by our front driveway that looks like a giant cement slab gravestone. It has writing on it. It's not readable from age and weathering. I drove this route the next day from my house back to Whataburger, and none of the tennis balls were there that had been the previous night. I used to live on an old farm where the farmhands' quarters had been made into a rental apartment. We felt a strong and unwelcoming presence in the apartment at night, movements and such too, but the absolute impressive experience were the horse ghosts. After living there for some time, the owner renewed the old stables to be rented out for horses. Shortly after, 3 horses took residency there, and not long after we heard it for the first time. Around 8 p.m. we heard a horse walk into the courtyard. We both jumped up and ran out, believing a horse had gotten loose. I ran to the stables, and my ex ran out to look after the horse. When he rapidly pulled open the door to the stables, I saw 3 shocked horses looking back at me with a puzzled expression. My ex hadn't seen anything either, so we shrugged and went back to bed. The day after, it happened again. This time, we ran to the windows and looked out from both sides. Nothing, only the vaguely lit darkness. A couple of days went before we heard it again, and we got used to it and accepted it, as it was the spirit of a horse coming to visit its friends. It kept happening at random, though the time we lived there was always around 8 p.m. Even our neighbor, who was a stern non-spiritual mechanic, heard it and totally lost her mind when she found we heard it too. A while later we learned the farm had burned down many years ago, and we assumed the poor horse had perished. Then, when suddenly new horses arrived, it found some new friends. Have you ever grabbed your camera or phone to try and capture something that you could not see but felt? While looking through them, you discover that you were right on the money. There was something that showed up that you didn't or couldn't see with your eyes, or you were taking pictures of an event, or with family and friends, with no funny creepy vibes. When you find out that feeling, was your gut telling you that something was off or not right or just weird? It makes you question all the times that you felt that feeling, and wonder if they were an indication that there was something there unseen by your eyes. This is an experience I had when I was 27. In late September of 1996, I stayed with a friend. Her baby girl and my baby boy were born one day apart in June. She and I had been friends for 8 years. We had many mutual friends, and I had been to her house many times since high school, which had been her late parents' house and her childhood home. Her mum had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's dementia young, in her early 40s, when we were in high school. Her dad kept her home until he could no longer care for her by himself, and she had 2 older brothers. The eldest moved out to go to college, then her elder brother was rarely home. When her mum passed away, shortly after my friend got married, the house went to her and her new husband. They updated it, moved in, had their daughter. Her husband worked for a coal mine and it was pretty far away and too far to commute back and forth home early every morning. So he got 1 3-day weekend off a month and then back to work. So it was just her and her daughter most of the time. She invited me and my son to stay over one night and I happily accepted. I was a single mum. My son's father passed away before he was born and he never saw him. I lived with my mum and her husband and was looking forward to a change of scenery and thought it would be good for my mum to have some time with him alone. We had a great time. Both babies were so cute and were both good-natured. She took lots of pictures of us all. We chatted and played with them, fed them, bathed them and put them to bed. We visited some places, and when she said she was tired and going to bed, I wanted to wind down for a little bit, so I stayed up a bit longer. After she went to her room, I checked on my son. I went to the living room and sat on the couch. I sat there alone, in the quiet. I had this funny, creepy feeling that I was being watched and got goosebumps. I told myself that I was being silly, and that I was tired from lack of regular sleep. I shrugged it off and got up and ready to go to bed. We all slept through the night. The next morning we hung out and I stayed until about 4 p.m. It was nice. Before I left, she said we should take the pictures to be developed and would get 2 copies made and would let me know when she got them back. 2 weeks later, she called and said she had them and if I wanted to come by and get them. Then she said that she wanted to show me something in a few of the pictures and would not elaborate further, just that she and her husband wanted my opinion. I said I'd be there shortly. My mum let me leave my son with her. When I got there, I didn't pick up on anything until she opened the envelope from the picture developer. We were looking through them, and they were so good. Then before she got to the last, she paused and told me that there was something in these pictures they couldn't figure out. I was curious. She seemed a bit hesitant and showed me the first of a series of 3 pictures she had saved for last. They had been taken one after another. I was sitting on her couch holding her daughter, and she pointed out that there was something strange to the left-hand side of us. I looked at the picture and saw what I thought was a slight white blur to the right of us, a little about my shoulder. At first I thought her daughter or I moved slightly as she was taking it, or she moved it as she was taking it. She then showed me the next one. There was something that looked like a white transparent smoke or mist, and it was bigger than in the first picture. I squinted at it and tried to think about what it could be. We didn't smoke. No candles burning, no mist vaporizer. I then watched her pick up the last picture. My eyes widened when I saw what looked like something sitting on the couch beside us. It reminded me of ectoplasm from the movie Ghostbusters. It looked like an apparition was forming. It was milky white and translucent. It looked like it had a head with a skull-like face. It seemed like it was leaning in towards us with an arm that could have been a hand up to the side of the face, like it was resting its cheek against its hand, curled so the knuckle held it up, with the elbow sitting flat on a table, sitting and gazing at us. A head with a shoulder, its arm bent at the elbow, resting his chin on the bald hand. There was a bit of what looked like its upper torso. It looked like it had tried to form more but stopped at that point. It was facing us, the left side of its face to the camera. Its profile slightly turned, showing the right eye socket. I was stunned. Chills covered my body. My mind was trying to register this. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Her husband came into the kitchen, greeted me, and saw my expression. They both felt the same way. We tried to come up with a plausible and rational explanation but could not. Then I remembered how I felt that night and told them about it. They were looking at me with looks of wide-eyed incredulity, but believed me. It showed up on their negatives too. I asked them if they ever felt that way. They both said they hadn't. Of course, he wasn't there a lot since they moved in, and this was her family home, and she felt comfortable there. It did not feel sinister, and it didn't last very long. It wasn't a black mass, it was white. I later found out she showed her older brothers copies of the pictures, and they had the same reaction. She asked them if they ever felt anything, watched them, or had any strange experience. Her brother, the middle child, said there was a ghost in the house and he saw it when he was a kid. I forget what else she found or if he elaborated more on it. If it had been evil or negative, I'm not sure if he would have told her. I'm not sure if he wouldn't tell her more to not freak her out, other than what she saw, and she was surprised by this. She never had experienced anything like this, nor had the elder brother. Of course, she was a bit unnerved. I've never had this happen to me before or since. I had just moved to Laughlin, Nevada, to work in a casino. I got an apartment not far away. Everything was going well when one night, on the crap table, a box man I hadn't worked with yet came and sat box. I literally was instantly in love, with a crazy, indescribable attraction. He spoke to me, but mostly turned his chair toward third base. I was on second base. He was supposed to watch the whole table. This went on for weeks. I'd catch him looking at me from other pits. One night, all the dealers were up in the bar after everything, so I went too. We talked that night till daybreak. He said the moment he walked up to the table, the first time he saw me, the attraction was so intense it practically made him fall into the box chair. He couldn't look my way, or he couldn't do his job at all. We started dating. Eventually he came to my apartment, where I said I had some strange things happening with the lights going on. My stepdad had died a few years before, and I'd say, "Bob, please turn the lights back on," and on they would pop. I always assumed it was my stepdad checking on me, being so far from home and family. So we were done with dinner, having wine and getting loose, and I start telling my new boyfriend about the light thing. He says he doesn't believe in that kind of thing. Well, I then say out loud, "Hey Bob, can you turn..." Bam, the lights come back on. I swear it almost ruined the date. We move in together because we slept together that night, and I on the pill got pregnant first time. A few months later, he buys a house for all of us. Now the new house, Bob has a new trick. He likes to turn the channel to a completely random one, a lot. One day, going through my boyfriend's stuff he had in his storage, he shows me his family genealogy book. I say, "Ooh," and grab it. Well, his family is all from the exact town in Canada that my dad was born, with tons of family still there. Some of my boyfriend's sister and brothers went to the school with my family members. This leads to a discussion about how it always felt like we were being pushed together. And getting pregnant like that felt like someone wanted to make sure we didn't miss the cues about our destiny. He had moved from Canada to Laughlin, and I came from Washington to Laughlin to find him. After the baby was born, we would see a figure walking down the hall to check on the baby. We've moved to a few states since then, but there's still occasionally things going on, like a figure in the hallway, but more so with our kid. She's 22 now. Bob still checks in on me, and now he checks in on the daughter. That's our ghostly love story. Every single time I walk by my sisters in my room, I saw two people. A small young boy, a taller but still young girl about the same height as me, and I was 8. The boy looked about 3 or 4. I thought it was creepy, but that I was just seeing things. The kids were intrusive though, because when me and my mum were picking up my sister, they were appearing on the rooftops. This story is different, however, because my mum did believe me. One day, they just disappeared. I was at work one day, and me and my colleague went for a cigarette. When we came back, we had a few minutes left and decided to take the elevator to the canteen. All the way down the hall, there was a woman walking about 10 feet ahead of us. The lift door opened. Anyway, this lady walks into the lift but does not turn around, and the lift doors start to close. At this point, wanting to get into that lift to not let any further time pass, I run up to the button and pressed it in order for the lift doors to open before it starts going down. They begin to open again. And when the lift doors are fully open, my colleague and I walk in, and the lady was gone. We got to it before the doors closed fully, and there's nowhere she could have gone. In broad daylight. I decided not to work evenings there anymore after this creepy occurrence. Hey guys, it's Mort here. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed tonight's Phantasmal Encounters. If of course you did, let me know down below as usual. It is very much appreciated. And if you're new here and I've only just started listening and you made it to the end already, well done. Why not subscribe? You probably should do that to be notified every time I post. Generally speaking, twice a week, generally speaking, Tuesday and Thursday, and with a big compilation of stories from the past few years on Saturday or Sunday. This week should be Saturday. So there you have it. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to my members and my patrons whose names can be seen on screen. If you'd like additional perks, exclusive stories and stuff like that, you can check out my Patreon where you can, get exclusive content and occasionally prizes. And on memberships too, you get the YouTube membership badge that you see some of the people in the comments with, and a few other, perks every once in a while, I suppose, like Patreon. Anyway, that's it from me. Thank you so much for listening. I'm so grateful for you guys being here, and thank you for staying till the end. If you'd like to watch more, you can find some oh, there they are, on screen now. Why not have a listen to some of these, maybe? Until next time, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.